Welcome back. You're watching News Center. The World Economic Forum has released a report on potential global risks in the coming years. With over 50 nations heading to polls, the report has highlighted AI-driven misinformation as the top threat in 24. The report also underscores extreme weather events, critical changes to Earth systems and ecosystem collapse as the top 3 threats in the next 10 years. To delve deeper into the report, we're now joined by Saadia Zahidi, Managing Director at the World Economic Forum. Saadia Zahidi, thank you so much for joining us. Let me begin by asking you about the impact of the Ukraine-Russia war, the Middle East crisis. How do you think this is going to hurt the global economy this year?
I think we're likely to see, we are already seeing some of the disruptions when it comes to shipping routes. And obviously that is a big unknown factor in a world where we were starting to tame inflation, starting to deal with some of the previous shortages and high prices around fuel and around food. And I think that's a re-emerging risk and could be a potential source that again leads to a more uncertain inflation outlook than had previously been envisaged.
Right. Now, in terms of the multipolar poles of power, this report talks about many power centers that are coming across the global north and the global south. How do you think these different power centers, these countries are going to impact governance through contradictions in their policies and contradictory views on how to approach global governance?
It was very interesting to see more than 2/3 of our respondents believe that we are heading towards a multipolar world order, but that we are in the midst of a shift. And it is unclear where we will end up, and it's not necessarily that it's good or bad, but it certainly means that in the midst of this transition, it will be harder to have global cooperation. So, for example, climate is one bright spot where the world is coming together. We are starting to have some movement. Last year's agreement at COP28 was very important and a shift forward. But there are other areas, for example, like mis and disinformation, for example, like artificial intelligence governance, where more needs to be done in bringing different groups together. However, this year's report, we do also point out that not every global risk requires waiting for cross-border cooperation. There are many things that governments can do alone in terms of localized strategies. There are many things that a coalition of the willing can take on and can feed a sort of a breakthrough endeavor in terms of finding solutions. And there are many things that are really about individual action. So, for example, governments need to be doing more in terms of media literacy and digital literacy, which then can support mitigating the risk around artificially intelligence-generated mis and disinformation. So there are many things that are within the agency of governments and individuals and businesses and do not necessarily need for us to wait for global cooperation to come through. And I think that's so important right now because most of these risks are occurring in tandem with each other. So in the 2-year time frame, you showed that list there. In the 10-year time frame, there's also environmental risks as well as societal and economic ones. These things require us to sort of fire on all cylinders at the same time. And that's why I think it's not only about global cooperation.
Right. I would also like to ask you about economic strains on low and middle income countries. This is also one of the threats that the report talks about. Any particular strains on India that you expect in 2024?
Well, we did examine this broader potential risk in the long term. You know, are we looking at sort of a stalling of economic development? Are we looking at a situation where living standards get roughly frozen where they are because there isn't as much of a focus on developing economies and their pathways to growth? Now, that said, I think India is in a very different situation. It is already an economic powerhouse. It is a country that's among the very few of the larger economies that's expecting to have more than 6% growth over 2024. So it's a very different picture. There are, of course, risks. There are technology-related risks. There is mis and disinformation-related risks. There's concerns about illicit activity. But there are concerns that are more in the realm of will there be shortages of skills, and not that will there be a shortage of economic opportunities to be able to grow. So I think India is in a very different situation. And one of the specific areas we point out is that India really has an opportunity when it comes to disrupting the concentration that is happening around the latest developments in technology, and has both the skills and the technological capabilities to actually become an AI-related powerhouse itself.
Right. That indeed is an important point. You're saying that India has the ability, the potential to take a lead in the AI revolution. You've also spoken about the risks and threats related to artificial intelligence, especially as polarization grows around the world. And if the technological challenges remain unchecked, the report says that truth will come under pressure. As different geographies in Southeast Asia and around the world, US for that matter, a major economy going for elections later in the year, India is going for elections in May this year. What is the larger worry around misinformation?
So I think this is obviously an incredibly important year, this and next year. And in some form or the other, there are national or municipal elections that are affecting nearly 4 billion people if we look at the next 2 years. So the concern then really becomes, will there be those that use these very zero-cost or low-cost ways of producing synthetic content and use that to disrupt what people are thinking about key issues on their election agendas, whether that is issues of social justice, whether that's issues of health or issues of education or issues related to jobs. And so players that want to use some of these technologies now simply have much more available to them. It's not that it changes necessarily outcomes. I think that remains to be seen, but it can cause disruption in the process of elections around the world. And that's the risk that the respondents to the survey are pointing out. And it's quite surprising that it went from last year being at a risk that is number 16 to this year jumping up to number 1 in the 2-year time frame. And I think people are quite conscious that with this many people making decisions around their decision makers, that this could be a big disruptor. Now, that said, there's a lot that can be done as well. There's a lot that social media platforms can do in terms of content moderation. There's a lot that the media industry can do around their standards and principles. And there's a lot that governments can do in terms of media literacy and online education for their citizens. So it's nothing that we're predicting as a forecast that is hard and fast. We're pointing out that the risk around this is quite high.
Right. And finally, very briefly, Sadia, if you could give us a sense of environmental risks. The El Nino, this was also referred to in the report. How big an economic risk is this to the global economy this year? Which countries are the most vulnerable, according to your survey?
Yeah. So extreme weather comes out as the number 2 risk in the 2-year time frame, and it comes out as the number 1 risk in the 10-year time frame. And in that 10-year time frame, there's even concerns that we could be going past the tipping point on some of the critical ecosystems of the Earth, and that we could be looking at massive loss of nature and biodiversity. Now, all of that has an economic impact. That has an economic impact in very local communities that are unable to adapt to those forms of extreme weather, but it also has a larger economic impact. So, for example, droughts, floods, that can change completely the availability of water supply, that can change the availability of food. Some of these weather-related events have also changed shipping routes. They've changed access across different parts of the world, canals, etc. So there's a massive impact, and I think we know that, and that is why there needs to be, of course, even faster efforts in terms of mitigation. But there also needs to be some adaptation-related efforts, and that really applies primarily to the Global South, which is most at risk.
All right, Sadia Zahidi, thank you very much for joining us on the Global Risk Report and telling us about the big risks for the world economy and the advantages that India also has at this juncture. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of News Center. More news and updates right here.